Good evening. It's so great to be back and learning with you. Let's light up the darkness. I had an anxiety dream last night that I was back after a few days away and that I taught the class. And in my dream, I taught the whole class. And then I realized that I did not have the camera on. And I was trying to figure out, do I have to go back and teach this whole page again? I guess I do. But then I woke up. How's everybody doing? It's great to be back. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina. Paul in the Great Northwest. Joe in the Inland Empire. Nancy in North Carolina. Melissa in Great Neck. Shandor in the Bronx. Belle in Texas. Bella in Florida. Lorraine in Texas. Sharon in New Jersey. Bill in mid-Missouri. Lucy in Minnesota, Ellen, Southern California, Hyman, Florida, Spencer in Connecticut, Marie in Freeport, and it's good to be back. Had a terrific screening in the Boca International Jewish Film Festival at the movies in Del Rey. Met the theater owner, Rochelle Walters, who definitely wants to program the movie when it opens in theaters across America this summer, so it's all very exciting. Anyone who's in the LA area, would love to see you at my first ever book signing for the book, Let My People Laugh, Greatest Jewish Jokes of All Time. That's tomorrow night here in LA at Barnes & Noble at The Grove. That's relevant to this class because we have to have the class at a special time tomorrow so we can get over there, set up, etc. So apologize for that. But class tomorrow is going to be 2 hours early. We'll put a post on the Facebook page, Nina, if you would do that. 4 p.m. Pacific tomorrow instead of our usual 6 p.m. Pacific. So just tomorrow's class, 2 hours early, since I have to be at the book signing a little bit later. I apologize. I have a runny nose. I don't think I have a cold. It's just that time of year. The allergies are acting up. I've taken some antihistamine. So hopefully it won't be too much of a bother during class today. Okay. Without further ado, we have a double daf. So let's get into it. Our pages are 78 and 79 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, the 24th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 2, here in chapter 9, we're talking about death penalty offenses and specifically murder. And the particular kind of death penalty for murder is decapitation by the sword. When does it apply? When does it not? Some counterintuitive holdings and results we'll be covering tonight, that's for sure. And as always, remember that a rabbinic court, the default position is they don't want to execute, right? They don't want to execute. So it's really a very high threshold that's necessary to overcome in order for a court to order an execution. Doesn't mean that the relevant crime is permitted or approved of. It certainly is not. But the question is a rabbinic court going to undertake to perform an execution? Now, it hasn't since late in the Second Temple period, right? So that doesn't mean that, certain kinds of murder are permitted, even though under halachic law, under Torah law, it would not result in a court-ordered execution. It's just that, generally speaking, a court-ordered execution from a rabbinic court, it's going to be a rare thing indeed. And we've already talked about how difficult it is to overcome the requirement for certain kinds of transgressions that, two witnesses see it, warn the defendant at that time, if you do such and such, you're going to be liable to this penalty, in this case, the death penalty. And then the person says, I heard the warning. Pretty much they have to acknowledge that the warning was heard, and I'm going to do it anyway, and does so right after the warning was given. Like, that's kind of the only circumstances where this is going to happen. So you can imagine it's almost never happened in history, except when there are times of need, right? When the court, the rabbis of that generation absolutely have to discourage certain kinds of behavior, and then they will do what's basically an extra legal or extra Torah, outside of Torah law execution, because it's an emergency situation. That's not what we're talking about here. Okay, we picked this up on page 78a, pretty near the top. So Rava says, all concede that in the case of one who kills a treifa. Okay, what's a treifa? A treifa is a animal, is what we're usually talking about, but it can also be a person. And it's an animal or a person who is wounded and has a wound that will result in the death of this animal or person within 12 months. That person, from a legal point of view, is already dead. Right? And it has to be virtually certain that that person is going to die within 12 months. This comes up a lot when we're talking about kosher meat. Right? So when you slaughter a kosher animal in a kosher manner, but then you discover that the animal had a wound, often some kind of a puncture in the lung, which would have led to that animal dying within a year. So then that animal wasn't actually slaughtered by the kosher slaughter. It was considered already dead. And that's why you'll hear Jews often refer to non-kosher meat as treif, right? But that's a kind of sort of like a figure of speech that's just become common. But the legal definition of a treifa is a wound that will lead to a death within 12 months. This can pertain to a human too. So the concept here is, if this person's already wounded and on his way to dying and you murder him, are you legally liable so that a court would step in and execute you? No, because this guy was essentially already walking dead. This is going to be contrasted with a person who has an illness. You don't become, if you're going to die within 6 months, you're not considered a treifa. That's only about a wound. Right? So a person who's ill or at the, somehow in a final stage of life, in hospice care, maybe has a terrible disease, maybe it's just very old. If you hasten that person's death in some way, you can be guilty of murder, right? So this, mortal illness versus mortal wound produces different result if somebody steps in and kills the person, hastens the death of the person, right? So Rava says, all concede that in the case of one who kills a treifa, he is exempt from liability, as in a certain sense, the legal status of the victim is already that of a dead person. All concede in a case where one kills an individual dying from an illness caused at the hand of heaven, that he is liable, as no other individual took action contributing to the person's death, and the murderer alone took his remaining soul. This is true even if somebody's going to die like in a day, and somebody steps in and kills him. An old man who's been alive for 80 years and he's going to live one more day, but you step in and kill him. Maybe you're thinking you're going to spare him pain, but legally under Torah law, that's murder. You cannot hasten a death that even if the hand of heaven is going to cause it very soon. Now, they disagree only in a case where one kills an individual who is dying from an injury caused at the hand of a person. So somebody wounds someone else, and it's a murderous blow, but he hasn't died yet. And then a second person steps in and actually kills. So since that person was going to die anyway, but simply wasn't dead yet, and then it would be murder by the first assailant, do we say that the second assailant, it's like he struck a treifa? Or do we say that it's more like striking somebody who is going to be dying from an illness at the hand of heaven? And therefore, it is murder because you hastened his life. You took away his soul earlier than it would have been taken away. And so there's a disagreement here, right? They disagree only in a case where one kills an individual dying from an injury caused at the hand of a person. So one sage in this debate, one side is the rabbis, right, the majority, likens this case to the case of a treifa, and therefore rules that the one who kills him is exempt. And the other sage, Rabbi Yehuda, likens this to the case of an individual dying from an illness caused at the hand of heaven, and therefore rules that the one who kills him is liable because he takes away some of his remaining life. Now the Gemara asks, and as for the one who likens this case to the case of a treifa, what is the reason that he does not liken it to the case of an individual dying from an illness at the hand of heaven? So the Gemara answers, in the case of an individual dying from an illness caused at the hand of heaven, no action was performed by a person to kill him, right? There's no first assailant in the case of somebody dying of an illness, whereas in this case of an individual dying from an injury that was caused by the hand of a person, the first attacker, so an action was performed by that first attacker to kill him. Therefore, it is a case of two people who performed an action together, and they are not liable. Because here you might say it's unclear who really killed, right? Two people contributed to this murder, and it's not sure which one actually did the killing. Seems pretty obvious that the second one actually ended the life, but maybe what he did to him wouldn't have happened if he wasn't already dying, right? And so where it's obvious that between the two of them, a murder was committed, so you should probably just, throw the book at both of them. But like I said, it's a very high barrier to overcome before a rabbinic court would step in and impose a death penalty. And if there's any source of uncertainty, they won't. Now, a person who commits murder is still going to be liable at the hand of heaven and is going to be held accountable. His soul will be held accountable either in this world or in the next. We don't say that this is permitted, and we wouldn't shield a person who was arrested by a secular authority, right? Remember that Dina de Malchus Dina, the law of the land is the law, right? So if in the jurisdiction where you live, like let's say America, where two people join together to commit a killing, they're both going to be guilty of murder. We're not going to try and step in and shield them from that and say it contradicts Torah law. But the only thing we're asking is, will the rabbinic court impose the death penalty? Now the Gemara asks, and as for the one who likens this case to the case of an individual who is dying from an illness caused at the hands of heaven, what is the reason that he does not liken it to a treifa? So the Gemara answers, in the case of a treifa, his status is like that of one whose organs, meaning the trachea and the esophagus, are cut, and he is considered to be slaughtered. I mean, he's just a few seconds away from bleeding out. The status of this individual dying from an injury caused at the hand of a person is not like that of one whose organs, the trachea and the esophagus, are cut, as there is no particular defect. Rather, he is like one suffering from general frailty, like any frail or elderly individual. So the one who comes along and shortens that life is guilty of murder, as opposed to somebody who's, just seconds away from bleeding out. And whatever action you do to him, you're not going to change the fact that he was going to die in a few seconds. So there you would not have liability. Now, a Tana taught a Baraisa from Rav Sheshes, the verse that states, "And a man who strikes any soul mortally, he shall be put to death." Leviticus 24:17. This is the basic law of murder. Excuse me. And this serves to include the case of one who strikes another, and it is a blow in which there is not sufficient force to kill. And then another individual comes and kills him. So the verse teaches that the second individual is liable. Now the Gemara challenges this immediately. If the first individual struck him with a blow in which there is not sufficient force to kill, well, then this law is obvious, as the first person did not perform an act of killing at all. And it is only the second who killed him. If you punch me in the arm and then, Johnny comes over here and stabs me in the heart, God forbid, why would you have any responsibility at all? You punched me in the arm, that wasn't going to kill me. Johnny murdered me in that situation. That's obvious. So that must not be the case that we are talking about. Rather, amend that Baraisa to teach. The verse serves to include the case of one who strikes another, and it is a blow in which there is sufficient force to kill, and then another individual comes and kills him. So the verse teaches that the second individual is liable, right? You, God forbid, stab me in the heart, and I'm going to die from that, but I haven't died yet, and somebody else comes along and stabs me, in the back, right? So, and that was also a killing blow. So who's guilty here? What we've ascertained so far is that the one who strikes the second blow is for sure guilty, according to this Baraisa. And this unattributed Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who holds that one who completes the killing of an individual is liable to be executed as a murderer. Now, Rava says one who kills a treifa is exempt, as it is as though he killed a dead person. That's where we started today. And as for a treifa who kills another individual, interesting, right? Now you have somebody who has a wound that will kill him, not immediately. So if you murder that guy, well, he was already dead, essentially, so you would not be liable, according to that view. What about this person who is a treifa, and he goes and kills someone? What's the issue here? Well, the penalty for murder, when it's actually proven, you meet all the elements of murder, so the penalty for him is death penalty. But if he's a treifa, are we going to have a court order the execution of a person who, legally speaking, is already dead? And as for a treifa who kills another individual, if he killed him before the judge is in court, he is liable to be executed. But if the killing was not done before the judge is in the court, then he is exempt. What does that mean? So the Gemara explains, in the case of a treifa who killed before the court, right, in front of the judges. So you can imagine that if you commit murder in the courtroom, in front of the judges, it's not going to go well for you. Though there is a problem, because now the judges would be witnesses. And if they're witnesses, they can't be judges. But we're just putting that problem aside for a moment. Why is it that if a treifa commits a murder in front of the court, he'll be executed, but if he commits the murder outside of the court, he won't? That's the question we're asking right now. So the Gemara explains, in the case of a treifa who killed in the courtroom before the judges, what is the reason that he is liable? Well, he is liable, as it is written, Deuteronomy 13:6, and you shall eradicate the evil from your midst. From which it is derived that there is a mitzvah, a commandment, for the court to eradicate evil that it witnesses firsthand. In the case where the killing was not before the judges in court, then this man who is a treifa himself, he's going to die soon, he's exempt from court-ordered execution. Why? Because any testimony against the treifa is testimony that you cannot render conspiratory testimony. Meaning that even if the witnesses testifying that the treifa committed murder are found to be conspiring witnesses, they cannot be executed because they conspired to kill a treifa. And any testimony that you cannot render conspiratory testimony is not characterized as testimony, right? So witnesses who come to a court and say, we saw so-and-so do such and such. Now, if it's a death penalty offense, like for instance, we saw him commit rape, or we saw him commit murder, or we saw him commit idolatry, right? And then it turns out that the witnesses were liars. And we can prove that because other witnesses come and say, these witnesses who claim what they saw, they're liars because we were with those witnesses in another city on that day at that time. So now what the conspiring witnesses sought to do, which was to lie and then render the defendant liable to receive the death penalty, now those conspiring witnesses, they would receive the death penalty. But if you're conspiring to have a treifa executed, since technically, legally speaking, he's already dead, they will not be executed for giving that false testimony. And we have a general principle that if for some legal reason conspiring witnesses could not be rendered conspiring witnesses and receive the penalty that they sought to get for the defendant, then their testimony is not considered testimony at all, right? Witnesses have to be willing, and this is the motivation for them to tell the truth at the end of the day, that if they lie, they're going to suffer the consequence that the court would have imposed on the defendant if that lie were to be believed. And if we don't have that situation, for whatever reason, then the testimony is not accepted at all. And Rava says, one who sodomizes a male who is a treifa is liable to be executed for committing an act of sodomy. It almost sounds like, well, if you're saying the treifa is like somebody who's walking dead, then this sodomy is almost like some kind of necrophilia, right? Which is a crime in itself, but that's not the aspect of this that we're examining. We're saying, so if this is a death penalty offense, if sodomy is a death penalty offense, it remains one even if the victim of the sodomy is a treifa. And why would that be? And as for a treifa who sodomizes another male who's not a treifa, if he does so before the judges in court, he is liable to be executed. If the act of sodomy was not before a court, he is exempt for the same reasons of a treifa who commits a murder outside of court. And the Gemara explains, if he committed an act of sodomy before the court, he is liable. As it is written, and you shall eradicate the evil from your midst. If the act of sodomy was not before the court, he is exempt, as any testimony against a treifa is testimony that you cannot render conspiratory testimony. And therefore, it's not accepted at all. So the Gemara asks, why do I need this ruling? This case of sodomy is identical to that case of murder. Same result. In terms of it's a death penalty offense, and it's the same result if the treifa is the victim of the sodomy or is the one committing it. So why do we need this separate example? And the Gemara answers, it was necessary for him to mention the case of one who sodomizes a treifa, as there is a novel element introduced in that law. Lest you say, let the status of one who sodomizes a male who is a treifa be like one who engages in necrophilia, and therefore let him be exempt from execution, because even though this is prohibited, it's not a death penalty offense. To counter this, Rava teaches us that his liability is due to the pleasure that he experiences. And this man who sodomizes a treifa has pleasure, as although the legal status of a treifa is that of a dead person in certain senses, he is in fact alive, and the one committing the crime committed the same crime that he would have committed on non-treifa, and therefore he is still, you might have thought he's still subject to the death penalty, and then it sounds like he's not. And Rava says witnesses who testified with regard to a treifa that he committed a capital transgression, and then they were rendered conspiring witnesses. They are not executed, as they conspired to kill one whose status is that of a dead person. Witnesses who are themselves treifa and who are rendered conspiring witnesses are executed. And Rav Ashi says even witnesses who are themselves treifa, who are rendered conspiring witnesses, are not executed due to the fact that they are not susceptible to a situation where witnesses who rendered them conspiring witnesses can themselves be rendered conspiring witnesses. Witnesses who render the witnesses who are themselves treifa into conspiring witnesses, who are then rendered conspiring witnesses, are not executed because they sought to kill a treifa whose status is that of a dead person. Therefore, their testimony is testimony that you cannot render conspiratory testimony, and it is disregarded. We're just following that logic to its endpoint in the idea that, if you're trying to kill a person who's already dead, it's prohibited, but you're not going to be liable for murder, and you're not going to be rendered a conspiring witness who is subject to a death penalty for the same reason. And Rava says an ox that is a treifa and that killed an individual is liable to be executed like any animal that kills a person. And an ox that belongs to a person who is a treifa, and the ox killed an individual, so this ox is now exempt. And what is the reason for this law? It is as the verse states, the ox shall be stoned and its owner shall also be put to death. This would be a forewarned ox. Now, based on that on the juxtaposition between the owner and his ox, it is derived. Anywhere that we can read concerning the situation and its owner shall also be put to death, then we read, meaning we apply concerning it, the ox shall be stoned. But anywhere that we cannot read concerning it and its owner shall also be put to death, we do not read concerning it that the ox shall be stoned. And since the owner of the ox cannot be executed because he's a treifa and he's already going to die, his ox also is not liable to be stoned. And Rav Ashi says even an ox that is a treifa that killed an individual is exempt. And what is the reason for this law? Based on the juxtaposition between the ox and the owner. Since if the owner were a treifa, he would be exempt. An ox that is a treifa that killed an individual is also exempt. That's and that's the law actually, because the logic holds. It would be upsetting if your relative was the victim of this ox that killed, and then it turned out, well, the ox is going to die anyway, so we're not going to step in and kill the ox. I suspect that would be a situation where the avenger of blood, the closest relative, would just kill the ox. It's a treifa anyway. He's going to be exempt. He doesn't want it to live after it killed his relative, and I suspect that in that situation, nothing will happen to the relative who does that. But the court would not step in and execute the ox for the reason we just said. And what I just said about the avenger of blood is not on this page, and it's just Salitfak guessing. I'm not sure. Now, the Mishna teaches, if one set, now we're back to our Mishna number 2, different case than what we've been talking about a treifa. If one set a dog against an individual and the dog killed him, or if one set a snake against an individual and the snake killed him, then the one who set the dog or the snake is exempt from punishment. Surprising, right? If you have a pit bull that is, that can kill people, and you say, sick him, and it attacks a person and kills him, probably under American law, that would be murder. Although there would be room, there would be certainly room to argue against it. I mean, you didn't really know he was going to kill the person. It couldn't be, foreseeable beyond a reasonable doubt that it would lead to a murder. And that's what it is under Torah law. And especially when we're talking about a rabbinic court, which is so reticent, so reluctant to impose a death penalty, if a person, unleashes a dog and it ends up killing someone, it's not guaranteed that that was going to lead to a murder. Now, maybe he's going to be liable for the 5 kinds of damages, to the family of the murder of the victim of the dog, the owner of that dog will be liable for damages. But will the court impose capital punishment? No. If this person embedded the fangs of a snake into another person and caused the snake to bite him and kill him, then Rabbi Yehuda deems him liable to be executed, but the rabbis still exempt this person. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says, when you analyze the matter, you will find that according to the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, venom of a snake stands within its fangs, and in this case, the entire action is performed by the individual who embeds the fang in the other person's skin. The snake is passive. If you took a hypodermic needle with poison in it, and you stabbed someone with it, injected him with poison, obviously that's murder. Isn't it the same thing if you took a snake, held its mouth open, its dripping fangs there, and then implanted those fangs in a person, and then the person died, that you are a murderer? And that's what Rabbi Yehuda would say, because the snake is passive. Therefore, the one who causes the snake to bite is liable to be executed, and the form of execution would be beheading with a sword, which is the punishment for a murderer. And the snake itself would be exempt since it didn't do anything. But according to the statement of the rabbis, venom of a snake is discharged by the snake itself. The snake is the actual final agent of causing the death, while the individual who embeds the fang is merely an indirect cause. Consequently, the snake is executed by stoning, and the one who caused the snake to bite is exempt from execution. Quite counterintuitive. We wouldn't be happy with it, especially if we were the family of the victim, but shows the degree to which the Beis Din is reluctant to impose a death penalty. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Mishnah 3. In the case of one who strikes another, whether he does so with a stone or with his fist, and the doctors assessed the condition of the victim, estimating that it would lead to death, and then the person's condition eased from what it was, and then the doctors were brought back and they revised their prognosis, and they predicted that the victim would live. And thereafter, his condition worsened and he died. So did this person commit murder or not? Right? He struck somebody in the head with a stone. It looked really bad. The doctor said, yeah, he's going to die. Sounds like murder. But then the person got better. Well, he's going to live. And the doctors come back and say, yeah, he's going to live. But so now it sounds like it wasn't murder. Maybe you're going to be liable for damages for hurting someone. But then the condition worsens and the guy dies. Now he died as a result of this blow. But the doctors revised their prognosis from will die to will live in the interim. So did the one who struck with a stone commit murder? Says the Mishnah, yes. The assailant is liable to be executed as a murderer. Rabbi Nehemiah says he's exempt, as there is a basis for the matter of assuming that he is not liable. Since the victim's condition eased in the interim, so it was a cause other than the blow that was struck by the assailant that ultimately caused his death. We're not sure what it is, but we can't step in as a court and impose a death penalty under these circumstances. Minority view. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The sages taught that Rabbi Nehemiah interpreted this verse in arriving at his ruling. It is written in the Torah, Exodus 21:19. If he rises and walks outside upon his staff, then he that struck him is absolved. Only for his loss of livelihood shall the assailant, shall he give, and he shall heal him. Right? You owe damages for loss of livelihood and healing, right? Medical costs, etc., but not murder, right? Because the guy got up and walked around. We're on page 78b. Now the phrase, then he that struck him is absolved. This is superfluous. Would it enter your mind to say that this individual whom he struck is walking in the marketplace, and that the individual who struck him will be executed as a murderer? Rather, this is referring to a case where the doctors assessed his condition, saying that it would lead to death, and then his condition eased somewhat from what it was, and the guy walked in the marketplace. But then after that, his condition worsened and he died. And the verse is teaching that he is exempt. Now, this is not so unlikely or even unusual, right? people can get struck in the head, let's say in a car accident, and then be walking around. But there's actually internal bleeding. And, some hours later, maybe even days later, the person dies. It's from that wound, even though he was walking around. So are we going to say that the one who struck him is not guilty of murder? It's not so clear. We need to have some kind of a system for assessing, was the death, in this case of murder, caused by the blow struck by the assailant. So let's keep working on this. So the Gemara asks, well, as for the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Nehemiah and hold that the assailant is liable, and it's the majority, so that's what we follow, that is the law. So what do they interpret from the phrase in the Torah, then he that struck him is absolved? Sounds like the Torah says, well, if he got up and walked around, then you can't say the attacker is guilty of murder. So how can the rabbis say that he is guilty of murder? And the Gemara explains that according to the rabbis, this verse teaches that they incarcerate the attacker until the fate of the victim can be determined. And the phrase, then he that struck him is absolved, means that he is freed from incarceration, because it looks like it won't be a murder. But if the victim actually dies, this guy's still liable and guilty of murder, and we will impose that punishment if the other conditions are met. So the Gemara asks, and as for Rabbi Nehemiah, from where does he derive the law of incarceration? And the Gemara answers, he derives it from the incident of the wood gatherer in the wilderness. Right, the wood gatherer when the children of Israel were in the wilderness right after the Torah was given. And we learned that we don't do the work of the week during Shabbos, and this guy went out and gathered wood on Shabbos, and he was executed for it. This is right when the law was just given, Moses is present, we're living in a state of miracles, eating manna from the ground, clouds of glory, water from Miriam's well. The laws have just been given, and in that situation, they consult with God. It's like, yeah, we're going to kill him because he desecrated Shabbos. Has anyone been executed for desecrating Shabbos since then? Probably not, but this is the case that we study. Okay. So what happened there? So from where does Rabbi Nehemiah derive that there's a law of incarceration, right, where we incarcerate pending death penalty? So the Gemara answers, he derives it from the incident of the wood gatherer in the wilderness, with regard to whom it is written, and they placed him under guard, Numbers 15:34. Now the Gemara challenges, and the rabbis too, let them derive the law of incarceration from the incident of the wood gatherer. Why don't they? And the Gemara explains with regard to the wood gatherer, he was incarcerated because it was known from the outset that he was liable to be killed. But Moses did not know what form of capital punishment his death would take. So this is to the exclusion of this individual who struck another, with regard to whom we do not know if he is liable to be killed or if he is not liable to be killed. Therefore, one cannot derive the law in this case from the case of the wood gatherer. We knew the wood gatherer was guilty. Moses wasn't sure which death penalty. In the case of one who struck a blow, we're not sure if he's guilty of murder or not. If he is, we know what the death penalty will be. It'll be decapitation. But we're not sure if he's guilty. In the case of the wood gatherer, we knew he was guilty. The Gemara asks, and Rabbi Nehemiah, from where does he derive the law? He too should not be able to derive the halacha of incarceration from the case of the wood gatherer for the reason we just gave. They knew he was guilty. With this, we're talking about something else. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Nehemiah derives the law with regard to one who strikes another from the incident of the blasphemer, which is also in the wilderness at Leviticus 24:12, where Moses did not know if he was liable to be killed, and he nevertheless imprisoned the blasphemer. Right? So there, it's a different case. He's not sure whether he's guilty or not. So they incarcerated him pending that determination. So the Gemara asks, and the rabbis, why don't they derive the law from the incident of the blasphemer? And so the Gemara answers that the rabbis hold that the case of the blasphemer was a provisional edict, What's a provisional edict? Some explain that the reference is to the incarceration, which was a provisional edict because they did not know whether or not he was liable to be executed. Others explain that the execution itself was a provisional edict. Therefore, no laws can be derived from this case for future generations, neither from the generalities nor from the specifics. It's very different when we were in the wilderness with God present, and it's sort of, making sure that the laws were carried out in a way that we don't have those conditions at any other time in history. Provisional edict. So the difference between the uncertainty in the case of the wood gatherer and the uncertainty in the case of the blasphemer is as is taught in a Baraisa. Moses, our teacher, knew that the wood gatherer was liable to be sentenced to death. As it is stated, and you shall observe the Shabbos, as it is sacred to you, one who desecrates it shall be put to death. Exodus 31:14. But he did not know with which death penalty the wood gatherer was to be killed. As it is stated, and they placed him under guard, as it had not been declared what should be done with him. But concerning the blasphemer, it is stated only, and they placed him under guard, that it might be declared to them according to the Lord. As Moses did not know if the blasphemer was liable to be killed at all or not. So the Gemara asks, granted, according to Rabbi Nehemiah, that is the reason that two assessments are written. It is written in one verse, and if men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the victim did not die but is bedridden at Exodus 21:18, indicating that after the initial blow, the victim is assessed to determine whether or not he is expected to die. That's what the doctors are brought in for. In the following verse it is written, if he rises and walks outside upon his staff, then he that struck him is absolved. Exodus 21:19, indicating that you bring the doctors back. There's an additional assessment to determine whether or not this person has fully recovered. One verse is where they assessed his condition, saying that it would lead to death, right after the blow. And then he recovered fully. And the other verse is where they assessed his condition, saying that it would lead to death, and then his condition eased from what it was, and he died thereafter. But according to the rabbis, why do I need two assessments? And the Gemara answers, according to the rabbis, one assessment is where they assessed his condition, saying that it would lead to death, and he recovered fully, in which case the assailant is certainly not executed, but rather he pays damages and compensation. And one assessment, the other assessment, is where they assessed his condition, saying that it would lead to life, he would survive the blow, but then he died, in which case the assailant is also not executed, but he pays compensation. Same outcome, different circumstances. So the Gemara asks, in Rabbi Nehemiah, from where does he derive these two laws? And the Gemara answers, he holds that in the case where they assessed his condition, saying that he would live, and then he died, one does not need an explicit verse to exempt the assailant from execution, as he emerged from the court after the first hearing, innocent, when the doctors predicted that the victim would live. And the court does not rescind an initial ruling and convict him. The sages taught, in the case of one who strikes another, and they assessed his condition, saying that it would lead to death, and he recovered fully. So then the court exempts the assailant. If they assessed his condition, saying that it would lead to death, and his condition eased from what it was, they assessed the victim with a second assessment to determine the monetary restitution for damages. And thereafter, his medical condition worsened, and he died. So in that situation, the law is, follow the assessment that was assessed at the intermediate stage, which determined that the victim would live, so therefore the assailant is not executed. This is the statement of Rabbi Nehemiah. And the rabbis say there is no assessment after assessment. The death of the victim proves that the assessment at the intermediate stage was erroneous, and the assailant is executed. Right? The rabbis are saying we don't do two assessments on the same person. When we're talking about two assessments, we're talking about two different situations. One is where the doctors say, this guy's going to live, and then he ends up dying. And the other one is where the doctors say, this guy's going to die, and he ends up living. Those are the two assessments. Rabbi Nehemiah is saying, no, we're talking about two assessments on the same person, where the doctors change their prognosis. It is taught in another Baraisa, if they assessed his condition, saying that he would die. And then his condition improved, so they assessed his condition to determine whether he will live. If they assessed his condition saying that he will live, and his condition then deteriorated, they do not then assess his condition to determine whether it will lead to death, a third assessment. But the assailant is exempted from execution based on the initial determination. If they assessed his condition saying that it would lead to death, he would die, and then his condition eased from what it was, so then they do a second assessment to determine not whether he will live or die, but what is the monetary restitution for damages, as the assailant is certainly liable to pay restitution for the injury that he caused. Remember that you don't pay damages if you're liable for murder, right? So if there's any liability for murder, for a death penalty, since the death penalty is more severe, more stringent than monetary damages, we impose the more severe punishment, which is the death penalty, and then there is no damages. Now, where that gets really counterintuitive is if he's liable to be executed, but let's say we don't execute because there was some technicality with the witnesses. So then you would think, well, okay, he was liable to be executed, but he wasn't executed, so he should pay damages. But he doesn't. Because he was liable to the death penalty, even though we don't impose the death penalty, he's also going to skate on the monetary damages. That's very, troubling. It's troubling, but it emerges from the logic that we need in other situations. This is one of those ideas where, you have a legal principle that tough cases make bad law. We don't like that outcome, so we'd rather change the law. But if we change the law, we'd create a precedent that would lead to other types of problems that we also would not like. Now, the Gemara asks, and if thereafter his medical condition worsened and he died, the assailant pays restitution to the heirs for injury and suffering that he caused. So this is if he's not liable for the death penalty, then he pays damages. Now that he's already been exempted from the death penalty, if the victim ultimately dies of the wound, because there's no death penalty, he does pay damages, and now the damages are going to be much larger because the victim, didn't just have an injury and have loss of work and medical bills, but he even died. So that's just going to increase the damages by quite a bit. Now the Gemara asks, from when is the initial assessment of the value of the victim performed to determine the sum of the damages that the assailant pays? It is the assessment of his value from the moment that the assailant struck him. And the Gemara notes, and this unattributed baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah, as according to the opinion of the rabbis, he is liable to be executed even if there was a temporary improvement in his condition before he died. And in fact, that's the law. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Now, Mishnah number 4. If one intended to kill an animal and he killed a person that was standing adjacent to it, or if he intended to kill a non-Jew for whose murder he is not liable to be executed in court, again, it's not the business, right, of rabbinic courts to impose death penalties under anything but, Torah law, where it has to be so clear that they would do it, right? And of course, it's not permitted for a Jew to kill a non-Jew. And of course, we would turn a Jew over when the cops come to arrest him for murder when a Jew killed a non-Jew. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? Here we're talking about just under Torah law, whether a rabbinic court is going to impose a death penalty or not. And the death penalty doesn't apply in that situation. That's just the given. That's not really what we're talking about here. The question is, what was the intent of the person? And where we're going to get to is, even if he intended to kill Reuven, who is a Jew, but by mistake he killed Shimon, who is also a Jew, he had murderous intent, but he killed the wrong person. Yeah, under American law, that's going to be murder. But under Torah law, they're not going to impose the death penalty on that because his intention and his action didn't match up, even though there was murderous intent. Right? So this is to show you just how far, or let's say how reluctant a rabbinic court is to impose a death penalty. So if one intended to kill an animal, but instead he killed a person that was adjacent to it, or if he intended to kill a non-Jew, but instead he killed a Jew, or if he intended to kill a non-viable newborn, for whose murder one is not liable, and instead he killed a viable person. In all these cases, the assailant is exempt from execution because his original intent was to kill one for whose murder he would not be liable to a death penalty under Torah law before a rabbinic court. If one intended to strike another on his loins and the blow was not powerful enough to kill him if it were to land on his loins, but instead the blow landed on his chest over the victim's heart, and it was enough power to kill him when it landed in that location, and the victim died as a result of the blow, nonetheless, the assailant is exempt from execution, as the blow that he intended to strike would not have caused death, and so was not an intentional murder. That's why he's exempt. If he intended to strike him on his chest over his heart, and the blow was powerful enough to kill him if it was to land on his chest over his heart, but instead the blow landed on his loins, and it was not powerful enough to kill him when it landed on his loins, but nevertheless the victim died, still the assailant is exempt. Although the assailant intended to kill, the blow was not powerful enough to kill, so ostensibly his death was not a result of the blow. There's room for doubt. That's why we don't impose a death penalty. Page 79a. If one intended to kill an adult and the blow was not powerful enough to kill the adult, and instead the blow landed on a minor and the blow was powerful enough to kill the minor and the minor died, the assailant is exempt. If one intended to kill a minor and the blow was powerful enough to kill a minor and the blow landed on an adult and the blow was not powerful enough to kill the adult, and nevertheless the adult died, the assailant is exempt. Right? This is just to show how far they will go. If there's any doubt that the law applies, they don't apply the death penalty. But if one intended to strike another on his loins and the blow was powerful enough to kill him, were it to land on his loins, and instead the blow landed on his chest over his heart and he died, then the assailant is liable. Since in any event, his intent was to kill the victim, this victim, and the blow was powerful enough to kill him wherever it struck him. And if one intended to kill an adult, and the blow was powerful enough to kill the adult, and the blow landed on a minor and he died, the assailant is liable. Rabbi Shimon says, even if one intended to kill this one and he killed that one, although he would be liable for killing either, he is exempt because one is executed only if his action completely corresponded with his intent. And where did the law end up on this? That's the minority view of Rabbi Shimon. But the law goes like this. If one intended to kill a Jew, for whose murder he is liable to be executed, and he instead killed another Jew, he is exempt from liability in terms of being executed by a court. He's going to be liable for murder in the hand before the heavenly court. Eventually, he'll be held accountable because he did commit murder, but a rabbinic court won't execute him. Right? So it seems like we follow Rabbi Shimon there. That's the Mishna. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, with regard to which clause of the Mishnah does Rabbi Shimon disagree? If we say that he disagrees with the latter clause of the Mishnah concerning one who intended to kill an adult and he killed a minor. So the Mishnah should have employed the formulation, Rabbi Shimon exempts him, not the extended statement of, even if one intended to kill this one and he killed that one, he is exempt. So rather, he disagrees with the first clause of the Mishnah, which states that if one intended to kill an animal and he killed a person, or he intended to kill a Gentile and he killed a Jew, or he intended to kill a non-viable newborn and he killed a viable person, this assailant is exempt from execution. And from this, it might be inferred, but if one intended to kill this person and instead he killed that person, then the assailant is liable. But Rabbi Shimon disagrees and says, no, even if one intended to kill this person and he killed that person, he is exempt. He wanted to commit murder. He ended up murdering the wrong person. Under American law, for sure guilty of murder. But under this, a rabbinic court won't impose that death penalty, and that is the law. Now, the Gemara comments, if Reuben and Shimon were standing, and before throwing the stone or shooting the arrow, the assailant said, I intend to kill Reuben. I do not intend to kill Shimon. Okay, it is obvious that this is the dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon. If the assailant said, in other words, if he said, I intend to kill Reuben, I do not intend to kill Shimon. Now we know what his intent was exactly. And he ends up killing Shimon, right? So for sure, Rabbi Shimon is going to exempt him. Sounds like maybe the rabbis will still hold him liable. And we follow Rabbi Shimon. If the assailant said, I intend to kill one of them, and he did not specify whether it is Reuven or Shimon, then what is the law? Alternatively, in a case where he intended to kill one whom he thought was Reuven, and he killed him, but it was found to be Shimon, then what is the ruling? And the Gemara suggests, come and hear a resolution of this matter, as it is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says he is not liable until he says, I intend to kill so-and-so, and he kills that one. Now the Gemara seeks to clarify the rationale underlying the opinions of the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon, and asks, right? So it sounds like the rabbis would say, well, if he intended to kill a person and he ends up killing a different person, right? But in both are Jews, then he is liable to the death penalty. But Rabbi Shimon says no. Now, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? The verse states, but if there will be a man who hates his neighbor and he lies in wait for him and rises up against him and strikes him mortally and he dies. That's the definition of murder. Deuteronomy 19:11. So based on the repeated use of pronouns in the phrase, and lies in wait for him, and rises up against him, so Rabbi Shimon derives one is not liable to be executed until he intends to kill specifically him, the actual victim. So the Gemara asks, and the rabbis, what do they derive from the repetitive pronouns in that phrase? And the Gemara answers, the sages of the school of Yannai say that one derives this is to the exclusion of one who casts a stone into the midst of a group of people, and one of them is killed. Since he did not intend to kill any specific individual, he is not executed. Now here under American law, we have degrees, right? First degree murder, second degree, third degree, negligent homicide, manslaughter, etc. But what we're talking about now is not, does he have some culpability? Is he going to have to pay damages? Is he going to be a manslaughterer who's exiled to a city of refuge? We aren't asking those questions. We're only asking, is this person who did this act liable to the death penalty at the hands of an earthly court? And one who threw a rock into a crowd and it killed someone, even though it was certainly foreseeable that he might kill someone, you can't say that he had intent to kill that person. And for that reason, he won't be liable to the death penalty. Now the Gemara asks, wait a minute, before we decide what's happening or not happening, what are the circumstances? If we say that it is a case where there are 9 Gentiles and 1 Jew among them, right? And again, a rabbinic court doesn't impose a death penalty when a Jew kills a non-Jew. Doesn't mean it's permitted, doesn't mean it's okay, doesn't mean we shield this person from being arrested and executed by the secular law. Okay, what are the circumstances? If we say that it is a case where there are 9 Gentiles and 1 Jew among them, there's no need for a derivation. Derive that he is exempt from the fact that they are a majority of Gentiles. And based on the majority, the probability is that the stone will strike not the Jew. So alternatively, if the group of people comprises half Gentiles and half Jews, then the principle is that the ruling in a case of uncertainty with regard to cases of capital law is to be lenient. And therefore, the one who threw the stone will be exempt from punishment, from the death penalty. Again, because the court is so reticent to impose a death penalty. But the Gemara says, no, that's not what we're talking about. It is necessary to have this derivation only in a case where there are 9 Jews and 1 Gentile among them, as this is a case where the Gentile is a fixed presence in the group. And the principle is that the legal status of any item fixed in its place is like that of an uncertainty that is equally balanced, and one does not follow the majority. This is what the rabbis derive from the phrase, and he lies in wait for him. So sounds like even if there's 9 Jews and 1 Gentile and he kills one of the Jews, we're still not going to execute because of that uncertainty. Now the Gemara asks, granted, according to the rabbis who say that if one intended to kill this individual and he killed that individual, he is liable. Well, then there is support for their opinion from that which is written in Exodus 21:22. If men struggle and they hurt a pregnant woman so that her child departs from her, she miscarries, and there is no tragedy, like they don't kill the woman, she just miscarries, he shall be punished. As the husband of the woman shall impose upon him, he shall give as the judges determine. In other words, he's going to have to give money because he caused the woman to miscarry, but he's not going to be executed for causing the death of the fetus. It can be inferred from the verse that if there is a tragedy, meaning if the woman dies, then there is no payment of restitution. Sounds like no money damages, because then it would be guilty of murder. And the death penalty would apply. That's why there's no monetary damages. And Rabbi Elazar says, it is with regard to a quarrel that involves the intent of each to cause the death of the other. Okay, so he was trying to kill the other guy, and he ends up killing the woman who's a bystander. Well, that sounds like, I'm trying to kill this one, I end up killing that one. And the rabbis say, yeah, death penalty applies. That's why monetary damages would not. So Rabbi Elazar says it is with regard to a quarrel that involves the intent of each to cause the death of the other that the verse is speaking, as it is written. But if there shall be a tragedy, then you shall give a life for a life. Death penalty. This is proof that in a case where one intended to kill one individual and he killed a pregnant woman instead, he is liable to be executed, which is why he does not pay restitution. But Rabbi Shimon disagrees. According to him, this verse, then you shall give a life for a life, what does he do with it? According to his opinion, the party to the quarrel is exempt from the punishment of execution in this case. Meaning that a life for a life does not imply execution, it implies monetary damages for taking a life. That's consistent with an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We never gouge out the eye of somebody who caused someone else to lose an eye. We force him to pay monetary damages. Why? Because if you chop off someone's hand and he's a surgeon, right, that's going to be different damages than if you chop off somebody else's hand, who can continue in his profession. Let's say he's a psychiatrist, and like losing his hand will be awful, but he can continue to earn his livelihood. Whereas if it's, a concert pianist, he can't. Right? So since the loss of an eye or a tooth or a hand or a foot is different for different people, we've never imposed that kind of physical exchange. Rather, it means monetary damages. Therefore, according to at least Rabbi Shimon, life for a life has the same implication. Monetary restitution. And this understanding is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rebbe says that the phrase, then you shall give a life for a life, does not mean execution, but rather monetary restitution for the life that he took. Do you say that it means monetary restitution, or does it mean only that the taking of an actual life? Based on the language employed in the verse, it can be determined that the reference is to monetary payment. In these verses, a term of giving is stated below, and you shall give a life for a life, not you shall take a life for a life. And additionally, a term is stated, now we're on 79b, a term of giving is stated above. He shall be punished as the husband of the woman shall impose upon him, and he shall give as the judges determine. That's monetary damages. So just as there, give as the judges determine, the reference is to monetary restitution, so too here in the phrase, give a life for a life, the reference is to monetary restitution. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. Rava says that which the school of Chizkiah taught diverges from the statement of Rebbe and diverges from the statement of the rabbis. The school of Chizkiah holds that in the case of where one intended to kill one individual, but he killed a different individual, he is exempt from both liability to be executed, counter to the opinion of the rabbis, and from the obligation to pay monetary restitution, per the opinion of Rebbe. As the school of Chizkiah taught, the verse states, and he who kills an animal shall pay for it, and he who kills a man shall be put to death, indicating that one who kills a man and one who kills an animal are comparable. So this teaches that just as with regard to one who kills an animal, the Torah did not differentiate between whether he does so unwittingly or intentionally, whether he acts with intent or with no intent, or whether he strikes in the course of a downward motion or in the course of an upward motion. And this is not to exempt him from paying monetary restitution in all these cases, but rather to render him liable to pay monetary restitution. As one who kills an animal is liable in any event. Doesn't matter, I didn't do it on purpose. If I kill your animal, I owe you for the animal that I killed. right? Because people's animals were their livelihood. Similarly, with regard to one who kills a person, do not differentiate concerning him whether he does so unwittingly or unintentionally, whether he acts with intent or with no intent, or whether he strikes in the course of a downward motion or an upward motion. And this is not to render him liable to pay monetary restitution for the damage he causes in the process of killing him, but rather to exempt him from paying monetary restitution in any event. Right? If you kill a person, sounds like according to the school of Hiskiyahu, you don't pay damages. Right? If you're guilty of murder, you're going to be executed for it, but you don't pay damages for a death. Well, that's not the law. Accordingly, it is derived from here that one who commits a transgression carrying the death penalty is exempt from paying damages for his act. That's true. If you're liable to pay with your life, court-ordered execution because you commit murder, you don't pay monetary damages because we don't pay for the same act. We don't impose two penalties, only the more stringent one. So if the death penalty applies, monetary damages do not. Now the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of with no intent? If we say that it means that he had no intent to kill at all, and he happened to kill a person, that is an unwitting murder, and that is mentioned explicitly in the Baraisa. Obviously the death penalty doesn't apply. So rather it is obvious that the reference in the Baraisa is to one who does not intend to kill this individual, but he does intend to kill that individual, and he kills the wrong individual. He had murderous intent. He just ended up killing the wrong person. And it is taught, this is not to render him liable to pay monetary restitution for the damage he causes in the process of killing him, but rather to exempt him from paying monetary restitution. And if, according to the school of Chizkiah, he is liable to be executed, for what reason was it necessary to exempt him from monetary restitution? Clearly the law is that one who is executed is exempt from payment. Rather, must one not conclude from it that he is neither liable to be executed, nor is he liable to pay monetary restitution. And with regard to liability to be executed in a case where one intended to kill one individual and he killed another, the school of Chizkiah holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that he is exempt from the death penalty, but then they go farther and say he is exempt from paying monetary restitution as well. Minority view. And that's where we've complete the discussion of Mishnah number 4, and we'll pick it up tomorrow, special time, tomorrow only, Wednesday, because of my book signing tomorrow night at Barnes & Noble The Grove, if you're in LA, at 7 p.m. But so tomorrow, we're going to have special time, 4 p.m. Pacific. Okay. Sharon, is denying treatment or heroic measures to a non-treifa, dying person, as if one actively murdered someone? No, right? So no. Murder is going to require a specific action for it to be called murder. Withholding treatment or life-saving measures, you might say that this person had an obligation and is going to be liable before the heavenly court, but they're not. That would not be a case of court-ordered execution. I would say 99.9% sure of that. Lucy, what happens if a treifa's status changes? For example, a treifa kills someone, so he's exempt from execution because he's a treifa. But it turns out the treifa does not die, but unexpectedly recovers, so he can no longer be considered a treifa. Is he still exempt since the treifa status was in error? Brilliant question. I don't know. Great question. I wish I knew the answer. But it shows you understand exactly what the issues are here. And finally, Michelle Terriot. It was such a pleasure to meet you and your family. I was so looking forward to seeing Nina, though, and missed her. Guns N' Moses was such a fantastic movie, very fast-paced, and everyone near me was on the edge of their seats. In fact, I sure was holding my breath at the end. Your direction was superb throughout and kept the audience captivated. I was so impressed. I'm recommending Guns N' Moses now to my friends to look forward to it in the summer. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much. Nina, you embarrassed me putting this question in the comment section, but thank you so much. Michelle, I really appreciate that you came out to the screening in Boca, and I'm thrilled that you were thrilled by the movie. That's what I've got for us tonight, and with God's help, tomorrow, special time, 4 p.m. Pacific. See you then. All the best. God willing.